Thank you for joining us. We're happy that you are here. This is our third webinar of the semester. We've been talking about COVID-19 in the food system and trying to understand impacts and explore solutions. We're excited today to have Michelle Miller from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems. The title of her talk is The Next Normal, Restructuring Food Supply Chains. Very excited to get into this topic. Also want to mention briefly that we're doing this one in cooperation with the Deaton Institute Within Reach Zero Hunger Conference, which I believe is concluding today. So if you've joined us from that event, thank you very much. We're happy that you came over to join us. Next slide, please. We have a couple of sponsors with this event, and I should introduce myself. My name is Bill McKelvey. I'm a senior project coordinator with the University of Missouri Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security. The Center for Food Security is one of our sponsors today, and this is a center based at MU in Columbia, whose focus is research, teaching, and outreach at the intersection of food security and food systems. We have a number of projects that we work on. The Missouri Hunger Atlas is quite popular. We do quite a bit of research and outreach around emergency food systems as well. Feel free to check out our website if you'd like to learn more. The other sponsor of this event today is the Community and Economic Development Food Systems Team, which is a part of MU Extension. This is a group of extension specialists who work on a variety of food system related projects, primarily doing community engagement and education to build healthy, more resilient, and more equitable food systems. Next slide. Briefly, the format today, we're going to hear from Michelle for about 30 minutes, and then we'll reserve the remainder of the time for Q&A, try to wrap up as close to 4:30 as we can. Folks are free to ask your questions, unmute yourself, or you can use the chat feature. And this recording and other recordings from previous webinars are available on our website, foodsecurity.missouri.edu. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Hendrickson, co-director of our Center for Food Security, to introduce Michelle.
Thanks, Bill. And I'm so excited that we finally have Michelle Miller here to speak with us at the university. We have worked together for many, many years. And I don't know anybody who's more knowledgeable about food chain and creating different food chains and thinking about logistics and thinking about all the different aspects of the food chain. So Michelle is the associate director at the Center for Integrated Ag Systems at UW. She's a practicing economic anthropologist, and she engages in participatory action research. So she's always doing research where her ears to the ground. She's with people. She knows what farmers are talking about. She knows what everybody in the food system, the different stakeholders in the food system are talking about. We've served for a long time on a multi-state research team together, and I always get all of these great resources from Michelle. She's holds degrees from UW-Madison. She's got landscape architecture, sustainable development, and she's worked for 2 decades up in Wisconsin on wildlife and conservation projects and farm projects. And so I'm just so excited to have Michelle with us, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mary. That was a warm introduction. I really appreciate it. University of Missouri is so lucky to have Mary, Bill, and all the others working on food security and food systems. It's really important work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the next normal. COVID has been a huge disruption, and everyone's wondering how long is this disruption going to last, and are these changes permanent? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first thing I want to share with you is just to think about what supply chain management means. It's really about managing material flow, but it's also about managing information flow. And by doing both of those, then you also need to manage risk. You need to be thinking ahead, how is a disruption going to affect material and information flow? I get to go to a lot of webinars lately, and I was at one last spring where an economist who works closely with the USDA just said, COVID-19 is a transformational systems shock, the biggest shock since World War II. And I think we've seen that play out. So I found this to be an interesting graphic. It helps us understand a little bit about where some of the bottlenecks are happening in the system. We've got both supply and demand bottlenecks. If we go to the left side of the screen, you'll see a funky star next to farm production. There have been a lot of bottlenecks in harvesting product, but also harvesting animals. And that gets into the bottleneck around food processing. There have been disruptions in things like containers, packaging, not being able to find the correct packaging, things that we wouldn't have expected. And then in the demand sector, we've looked at, we've seen a reduction in the demand for food that's been packaged for food service, because we've seen an increase in at-home cooking and an increase in hunger relief. The charity food system has really taken a beating as a lot of people have lost their jobs. So back in May 2020, almost a year ago now, supply chain professionals were trying to figure out what was going to be the impact of this disruption, because it was just unheard of. A global disruption of the food system was, expected to have some pretty serious ramifications. And the thing that most people expected was that there would be a moderate response with a virus kind of recurring over time. There'd be slow, long-term growth and a muted world recovery. And I think that's about what we've seen. Maybe even that might even be a little bit rosy of a picture, given that we're still contending with new variants of the disease. The more prolonged the disruption, the more the chances, the changes will persist. And I think, again, back in June of 2020, we still weren't even sure how much longer things were going to go on. I don't think anyone at that point expected it to be more than a year of stay at home. However, what we heard from supply chain managers who were familiar working in under regional disruptions like hurricanes and stuff was that they expected a 60% failure rate in small businesses due to those regional disruptions. In June, we could see that accommodations and food service was going to be hit pretty hard, having a very large negative effect, but also other sectors were going to be hurt too. For farmers, I know quite a few farmers who were unable to rent out their barns for weddings, for instance. And arts and entertainment around the farmers market definitely suffered. Not to mention, the stage in general really was hard hit. Also, transportation and warehousing, retail and wholesale trade, that all affects agriculture and food systems. So the expectation was that a full recovery to pre-COVID-19 sales would take at least 3 years. And this was going to differ by the kind of business. In food service, they were looking at restaurants in particular and could see that pizza chains and quick service were recovering from COVID much faster than independents. And that was due in part because independents don't have the financial means to endure a prolonged downturn. So as the months wore on, it was harder and harder for some of those small independents to keep going. This also applied to small franchises, those with 10 or fewer locations. I know in my town, there would be a coffee house that might have 3 or 4 locations. They're down to 1 location now, hoping to survive through the end of this pandemic. So independents are really vulnerable because they've got a minimal off-premise presence. You know, they don't have their sauces bottled for sale in all the grocery stores in the region. They don't have takeout often. They have limited digital capacity. Some, you know, the large franchises have, you know, order online, pick up at the curb, all that. They already were doing that, whereas the independents didn't have that capacity. They had in general, the independents tend to be white tablecloth restaurants often. So you're not getting value-based menu items. You've got more high-end menu items. We're already operating on thin margins, but really the bottom line was that they had poor access to capital. Oops. So I want to talk a little bit about how the food system is a network of businesses. Because I think that is helpful to think of it that way. And the network operates at different scales. So at tier 0, we have personal production of food. That's everyone doing their own garden. I don't know how many people were caught in the seed shortage last spring, but there was definitely a seed shortage. And then a few months later, there was a canning lid shortage as people were trying to put up the food that they had grown in their own gardens. There was under tier 1, we had direct producer to consumer. Farmers markets suffered in some ways because of the need to relocate and to not allow such tight congregation of people. Community supported agriculture farms reported that they saw their farm shares sell out well in advance of when they might normally sell out. Tier 2 is where you have a strategic partnership in supply chain relationships. Here, you might not know the farmer directly, but the store that you go to, the local independent store, might have your farmer's food in that store. Or in the case of Organic Valley, you might know farmers who sell into that processor and you know, choose their food when you go to the store. And then tier 3 is large volume aggregation and distribution. And this is where most of the food is moving in the food system today. This tier became very disrupted in the food system, and we saw lots of empty shelves and products, you know, that we wouldn't have expected to not be able to find all of a sudden disappearing before our very eyes. And then you've got global anonymous aggregation and distribution, and this is where you've got large companies who take corn and soybeans and break it down into corn syrup and lecithin. So the more global the tier, the more disruption experienced because of the pandemic. So the food system is a network with a structure, and the structure is complex, it's self-organized, it adapts freely, and it has market rules. And those rules can be explicit rules, like rules at the state or federal level about how the market functions, but they can also be rules at the business level, and can be rules that are not explicit, but they're implicit. And so they depend on trust and transparency in the supply chain for them to function well. Back in the 30s, whoops, I've got timing issues, I guess, on here. I didn't think I did that. Back in the 30s, was probably the last time we saw a big overhaul of federal rules for the food system. And that was largely to deal with the disruption of the Great Depression. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where food is grown and who eats it, and what that indicates about how the system has changed over time. So if this is a map from USDA, and those kind of olive green areas are called the fruitful rim, and that's where most of our fruits and vegetables are grown in the United States. The bright pink region, the Northern Crescent, used to have a pretty strong food production, wholesale food production system. A lot of canning companies in those areas, primarily to feed people in urban areas. Missouri lands in the heartland. There was, people did a lot of personal production of food, and there was also fruits and vegetables grown in that region as well. And that has really changed over time. We've also seen a lot of urbanization, and what planners talk about now is that we've got megaregions that are defining our food markets. So you can see that there are 11 circled regions on here. Those are kind of considered the 11 main megaregions, and those food moves in and out of those regions differently depending on their how much warehouse space they have, how well connected they are by other transportation modes, and it really has changed the way food moves. So the food system is a network of businesses, and that network has a structure. So as a structure, it's able to fracture, buckle, and really the biggest problem is that it warps over time. That back, when we had the Great Depression and the New Deal rules went into place, there was a different food structure back then than there is today. When the structure starts to fracture and buckle, we've got supply chains that then need to improve. Gosh darn it. We have supply chains that need to improve communication and feedback through the system so that they can address that disruption. And part of that requires that there be trust and an equitable distribution of risk and reward within the supply chains. Without that, we start to have real serious problems. So I wanted to talk about one structural weakness, and that is where the food system has warped over time, and that is the difference between food eaten at home and food eaten away from home. So food at home is purchased at a grocery store or grown in a garden or at a farmer's market or a CSA. And that percentage of our total food expenditures has been going down rapidly since I was born in 1960. So this chart goes to 2008 and you can, or 2018, and you can see around 2008, food at home and food away from home were about 50-50. And since then, people began spending a lot more money away from home. Okay, so then COVID hits. This is the big red spike is, or the red line is 2020, and the big spike is when the stay-at-home measures started to take place. That was in late March, early April. And, everybody basically had to eat at home. And you can see that it's still quite a bit higher than it was before COVID, that we are still continuing to spend quite a bit more money at home. I think a lot of grocery managers are hoping that this continues, that this dependence on and desire really to eat at home and eat food that you've cooked yourself is a long-lasting change. Another kind of warp over time has been concentration in the food system. And Mary and her colleagues have done so much really good work on this. We've got, since 1997, we've seen a really dramatic increase in consolidation in grocery stores. So as I said, those big grocery stores like Kroger were disrupted, impacted much more by the disruption of COVID, while independent stores didn't have the same level of disruption. But the big grocery stores have more staying power because they have more capital that they can use to keep the stores going through the pandemic. Those independent grocery stores are hurting, relatively speaking. But we also see concentration in processing and how that hurt us as well. So we've got now 85% of the market share is controlled by the 4 largest beef packing firms. If we really want resilience, we have to think about what is it going to take to add some redundancy in this system? How do, where do we put more processing, and how do we make sure that ownership is shared across more companies rather than being concentrated? So again, I've been talking mostly about material flow and what we need to understand about material flow to manage that well. There's also information flow and then managing risk. So a project that I'm working on now is to understand that material flow and what it looks like at a national level. Some early work on this was done using 2009 data and published in 2014. And my colleague Megan Konar and her team identified 9 core nodes in the food system. When they did this, they looked at all food, including all corn and all soybeans. So they were looking at all the movement of anything that was an agricultural product that could be eaten. And you can see that the 9 nodes, are Los Angeles, Chicago, Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, Iowa, California, Wisconsin, and then Atlanta, Gainesville as another core node. And the issue with these core nodes is that if there's a disruption to any one of these nodes, it can really upset the entire country. Well, we had all of them were disrupted, right? Here's a graphic just giving you a quick idea of geographically where these nodes are located and where some of the key vulnerable spots are in our food distribution system. So then Megan and colleagues did a little bit more work to try to figure out if they could identify food flow and how food was moving between counties. And what you can really see in this chart is the dominance of California in both production and processing of food. So in that outflow section, all those red bars are California, and the purpley blue bar at the bottom is Maricopa County, Arizona, which is a big production and processing county. And the inflow also is very interesting. So we've got some inflow in those California, Arizona counties, but 4 other counties crop up. Douglas County, Nebraska is Omaha. That's meat processing. You can see an inflow of live animals into Omaha for processing, and then moving on through the food system. Erie County, New York is Buffalo. Cook County is Chicago, and Sussex County, I don't think there's any really big city right there, but that serves the Eastern Seaboard as a distribution point. So I'm very much looking forward to working with Megan to update this, looking at the most recent data just came out last month. And we're also going to try to narrow our understanding of these food moves to food that's moving that requires refrigeration. So we can learn a lot from small disruptions that have happened and think about how fast can we respond? How long can businesses hold out? All those kinds of things. So when supply chain managers are hit with a disruption, they do 6 things. They look at what are the immediate needs. So in the case of COVID, we immediately knew we were going to have to deal with this huge disruption of food movements between food for processing and food service and food for grocery sales. We also knew that people were losing jobs left and right, and we needed to make sure that there was food in the charity food system to cover their needs as quickly as possible. We also had to improve communication and accelerate decision-making. We had to assess food chain operations issues, identify hazards, risks, and options, nurture collaboration, because people had to work together better, or it wasn't going to, or the changes we needed to make weren't going to happen. And then I want to, I think, stress the importance of looking for opportunities to upgrade and improve to meet our needs for resilience, rather than just repair what was damaged. We needed to think about, do we really need that, or do we want to invest in the next level innovation? So small farms responded really quickly to the pandemic. This is a guy that I work with. He sewed masks immediately and had his workers distancing and barely missed a beat, really. And I think that was true in independent groceries as well, that they were able to very quickly respond to the pandemic. They had shields up before everybody. They had aisles going one way. They had, they really responded, and the bigger chains did not. We saw a lot of communications and operations challenges areas. In 2019, the farmers market in my town looked like that. And in 2020, it looked very, very different. This year, it's a little bit more like 2019, but really not that much. So there were a lot of site changes to accommodate distancing, automated ordering and payment. There was vendor attrition because they didn't have internet access. And we also saw a lot of manager stress due to customer and vendor resistance to the necessary precautions. Workplace safety, labor availability emerged as really critical issues. This occurred throughout all supply chains, not just food, but it had a worldwide impact. It wasn't just the United States. We saw how vulnerable our food workers are, and we also understood better what the how processing was really a pinch point in the overall system. Another thing that happens during the disruption is that systems change can really accelerate, and we've certainly seen that with COVID. E-commerce has exploded, and it's expected to be the new normal. I think part of the problem here is, though, who wins and who loses. E-commerce was something that the big companies like Walmart, Target, Kroger, I'm forgetting one, Amazon, were already doing to various levels, but they were already, they had invested in those systems already. Independents then felt really compelled to also participate, and a lot of them lost a lot of money trying to provide the same kind of home delivery service. So again, who wins and who loses? Another thing that supply chain managers do is they're trying to reduce single points of failure throughout the supply chain. It doesn't matter what the supply chain moved, whether it was cars or furniture or, in our case, food. But people were talking about regionalizing as much as possible so that the long distance movements were shortened, and so that the supply chain had multiple places to access whatever it needed. A lot of times when we think about reducing, adding resilience to a system in agriculture, we think about it at the field level, but really it needs to happen at all levels. So the field level, the processing level, the distribution level, all levels need this attention to adding some redundancy to the system. Another example of that is that when New York City went through Hurricane Sandy, they decided to do a study of how their city is, city food flow is maintained. And a really interesting finding was that regional distributors were critical to making sure that New York was fed. 53% of the food in New York is regionally distributed, is not through national grocery distributors. And I think if you look at other parts of the country, certainly we expect to see in other mega regions, those 11 mega regions, we expect to see a number of those with very high reliance on national grocery distribution and much less opportunity for that regional. If you look at this graph, you can see that the regional bar at the very top that says 53%, those colors indicate that independent grocery stores and restaurants are really heavily reliant on regional distribution. So resilient supply chains are going to depend on collaboration, communication, trust, and fair market rules. And that's where that's what creates a food web that then can handle disruptions like COVID, like climate change. I've been talking a lot about supply chain management and the public interest recently. And, part of the problem or part of the challenge really is the communication side and the information side in supply chain management. So we're starting to get a handle on how food is moving. And we really need that big data in the public domain. Private companies have lots and lots more data accessible to them to understand how food is moving and how to make money in the food system. But if we're thinking about food access and market access, we also need big data for that. We also need models to be in the public domain. So being able to take that big data and find the patterns in it requires models that can help sort the data. And right now there's lots of models in the private sector, but not so many in the public domain. In February 2021, President Biden gave the directive to study critical supply chains. And so we're hoping and expecting to see some of this stuff covered in the around food and agriculture in the coming year. We also see a call to establish a federal office of supply management that came out in 2021 from supply chain managers, a whole coalition of dry goods companies, and Iowa State, I believe, was the other main author of that piece. And then also in 2021, US Secretary Vilsack came out with a very strong commitment to restructure markets so that they're more, new, better, and fairer. And so I think at least I hold a lot of hope that we can invest in what is really important in our supply chain and not just recreate the old structure that caused that failed so badly for us this last year. So that's it. Oh, you don't need to see all these other slides. I've got a whole bunch of them at the end.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yes.
Wow.
I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Wow. I think we can open it up to questions now. Did we have one in here earlier? Been watching the chat. Bill, did you see any questions?
There were comments and chatting in the chat. I don't know if I saw quite a question.
Yeah.
That's good. Let's do that.
Yeah. Is there any difference between, like, Missouri perhaps didn't have the same kind of lockdown that, say, Wisconsin did? And South Dakota famously didn't have any. Are there any differences in how, like, the supply chains worked in those places, or is it because of those choke holds? It doesn't really matter if states were shut down or not.
Well, I mean, let's talk about meat, right? So one of the problems that the processing plants had was that either way they cut it, they had reduced capacity to process meat. And a lot of meat animals are grown in the central part of the country, and then they're processed at the big plants in the central part of the country. And so if a meat processing plant decided we're just not going to deal with COVID and we'll just, let it happen, they'd have workers out of work because they were sick. And so they had to slow down because they didn't have the workers. If they actually slowed down and, did distancing and masking and shielding and stuff, then they could also handle less than they would have otherwise because, they were trying to address the health issues. So, whether or not there was a mandate at least in some areas, didn't really matter, because if people got sick, they got sick.
Yeah. Yeah. How sticky do you think some of the changes will be in terms of, you said a couple of times that this is the biggest, change since World War II, but then, like, it's a new normal, or we'll kind of edge back to the old normal?
Well, I think that the people who are doing, Nielsen testing and stuff like that are pretty convinced that people are going to still cook at home more than they did before the pandemic, that they've developed cooking skills that they didn't have before. Like, wow, it's not so hard to make a roast, you know, or it's not so hard to bake a potato. I grew up in a family that did always cooked. So for me, it was just like, oh, let's make something really intense, you know. But a lot of people learned that you bake your own bread, it's a lot cheaper. Or that if I think about dinner in the morning, I can put some beans on the stove and then not pay through the nose for canned beans. So I really think those cooking skills and appreciation for cooking will be a more lasting outcome of COVID. Another example is that people who are cooking at home, there are more people cooking at home if they are working at home. And at least in my place of work, there's a lot of talk about working more at home. We just don't have enough office space for everybody. And so one way to handle that is just to allow more people to work at home. So I think that's another reason why I think that particular change will be more long lasting. Everyone still wants to go out to their restaurants, but at least my favorite restaurants, most of those were independent restaurants. And so I know that some of my favorite restaurants have closed and won't reopen. So I'll spend less money. I've also gotten used to saving money. I kind of like that. I didn't realize how much I was spending until I wasn't able to spend it anymore. The other thing is the e-commerce piece, and everyone is just watching that. It's really not clear whether that's going to be the new normal or not, or to what degree. It probably depends on access to stores and things. I don't know about you guys, but every time I order shoes online, I get them and I don't like them, and then I have to mail them back, and I hate that. So, but Amazon has really made a commitment to dark stores. And, you know, Amazon bought Whole Foods not that long ago. And I went into my local Whole Foods a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't see anybody. I saw like maybe 3 other customers. That was it. Everybody else in the store were employees who were shopping for online orders for people. And then went out into the parking lot, and there were 2 vans with people loading groceries into the vans. So Amazon clearly has committed to that model. And part of it is then the use of a dark store. So they're building a fulfillment center maybe 4 miles away from me. And the whole idea of a dark store is that no one ever goes in there for a retail experience anymore. It's all warehouse picking individual products for individual orders. So they're really changing the way they think about how they fulfill consumer demand. I'd love to hear stories from anybody else that might have some about what's happened in their own place.
We do have a couple of questions there too. We have like
Okay.
3 questions now. So one of them is, are there any book readings or specific reports that you think we should be looking for when learning about and acquiring more information about how our supply chains work?
Oh gosh, loaded question. I have a colleague who just put out a new book on a second edition of a book on supply chains and the food system. That's a really great basic primer in how each individual supply chain works. For instance, one of the things that people think a lot is, you know, we've got all this food moving around the country. Why don't we just put it on trains? Well, that's actually a really complex thing. And the reasons that are, you know, you have to read a lot about that one to understand why food doesn't move on trains. Most of the food that's refrigerated, more than 90% of it, is moving on trucks. So if we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the food system, one of the things we need to think about is how much impact does eating fresh food have on the system, and how do we reduce or improve that metric at the truck level. Another book that I would recommend is Phil Howard's Power and Concentration in the Food System. Concentration in the food system, again, is a warp over time. We addressed concentration in the early 1900s. We need to do it again, and we need to think about what that looks like in terms of federal and state rules, but also in terms of trust and transparency. You know, implicit rules rather than rules necessarily on paper. So those are the two that come to mind first and foremost. I bet other people have ideas. Please type those into the chat or speak up if you've got one that you think is really, really great.
Michelle, what was the first book?
Oh gosh, I can't remember the title, and I'm not in my office at work, so I don't have it. I can't just grab it.
Who was that? Who's your colleague?
Wu, W-U.
Okay.
And trying to think of his other colleague's name because it's a double author. It's something like
Food Supply Chain Management?
Yep, that's it.
Found it.
Perfect.
Thank you, Bill.
And we have a question about what's the current role of blockchain technology? I know you know something about this. And what role do you see it playing in the future for consumers, researchers, policymakers, and businesses?
Boy, oh boy. So when I was talking about supply chain management of the public interest, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about blockchain. All the big companies have blockchain in place. They're using it to manage the privatized food supply chains. And as a result, they have information nobody else has or has access to. So when you go to the grocery store and you use your little consumer card that you get, you know, special deals with, which I do at every store I go to, they're gathering my information. They're using it for just-in-time management, for stocking shelves. They send that information to processors so that they get first dibs on that product. So if you're buying ketchup, they know that, and they send that to Heinz, and then Heinz says, oh, we've got, you know, a bigger demand for ketchup. Let's, you know, be sure to push that out. And by the way, Amazon, since you've been so great sharing your data with us, will, you know, put you high on our list for provisioning. So again, this is the kind of thing that's pushing out the independent business in the food supply chain, and we really want to make sure that that we address that. Blockchain is a great tool, but there are certain limitations that need to be placed on it. One of those is the ability to transfer data, to move data on and off a blockchain. So, you know, that data that I'm giving the store, that's my data. That's not the store's data. And even though they're collecting it. And so here's an example. We have a grocery store that was family owned for like 100 years in my neighborhood. And eventually it got sold to Kroger. Kroger decided a couple years ago to close that grocery store. And the city was really concerned because that grocery store serves a neighborhood that otherwise has no access to groceries. And so the city wanted to get data from that store so that it could entice another store to come in and take that place. But the data was not accessible. So that's the kind of thing where, you know, privatized data is problematic. Oh, I was going to say on blockchain, one more thing. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is, can we develop a information technology tool that goes beyond just market matching and starts to use make blockchain available to independent businesses that would also benefit from the transparency that comes in a system like that. I've been part of a project that's been working with an AI developer who, you know, an app developer who has a system that includes things like price discovery and transportation, load matching, and contracting, all sorts of different things that become really hard in a wholesale situation with independents, you know, so that data can be shared and there's more transparency within the supply chain.
Yeah. What might we see additional, or where might we see additional new capital and labor types of investments to have more resilience in the food chain in the future?
One of the things in our network study that I'm kind of excited about is that we, those core nodes, those 9 core nodes are kind of the, they're the first tier, the biggest markets, right? But there are also secondary and tertiary markets that make it possible to move food, especially out into rural regions. And I'm hoping that our study that's in process right now will start to give us an idea of where those secondary and tertiary markets might be. Those are areas that really need cold storage, for instance. So cold storage is one of the limiting factors on the food supply chain in general. And so everyone's clamoring for cold storage. So if instead of putting cold storage where cold storage already is, which is kind of a concentration of cold storage in those primary markets, if we start to think about what are the secondary and tertiary nodes of the system, and how do we invest in cold storage in those areas? So in Wisconsin, we're looking at something in southern Wisconsin that could serve Madison market, the Madison-Dane County market, the Milwaukee market, but would also be close enough to some of the other smaller cities in southern Wisconsin to make it to energize independent businesses there. And then we're also then thinking, how do we do micro fulfillment in places that are a little further away? Like for us, I'm thinking Wausau, Stevens Point area. What can we do to make it possible to have cold storage in those areas that could then serve Ashland Bayfield, part of Wisconsin, which is up on the Lake Superior shoreline? So those are the areas that are now considered remote and underserved. And we'd love to figure out a strategy to get fresh product and healthy product to those more rural, remote parts of the United States.
There's one, this is kind of an interesting question. With the pandemic caused increase in home cookery and edible gardening, has there been any observed increases in questions submitted or site visits to University Extension Services on these topics? It might be interesting to see those statistics if anyone is tracking that traffic and the topics of greatest interest among consumers. And we could maybe ask our extension folks who are on the call too, what they've seen with that.
I'll pipe up just. Oh,
go ahead, Michelle.
I'm just going to pipe up and say we're redoing our website right now, and so this morning I was looking at all of the hits on various pages on our site, and poultry. People are asking about poultry like crazy right now. In part because I know poultry is one of the most concentrated of the meat industries, and so small people who want to buy local fresh poultry are trying to figure out how to make it go in the business. But I'd be really curious if anyone else has insight like that.
Well, one observation that I've seen here in the Kansas City area is we're seeing a lot of people move out into the peri-rural areas, or I guess peri-urban areas, because they no longer need to, they're working from home. So they want maybe 10, 20 acres. So they're buying these smaller lots. And I don't know if the question remains whether or not they're going to be able to utilize that in food production, or if it's some kind of dream where they're going to go out there and find out that food production is harder than it looks. And so I think the jury's out on whether or not this will be a local food bonanza or it may be a flop. So that's going to, because we may actually lose food farmland in the process. So I'm a little concerned on how that transpires.
There was a funny song that came out not that long ago, and the line that just would crack me up was, "Going to the country, gonna eat a lot of peaches." Oh my gosh.
did you have any, Pam, did you have anything to add to that, or Sarah, anybody?
I was kind of hoping that Leslie Speller Henderson might weigh in. She may know a little bit more, but I don't know if she had to jump off. I don't see her here anymore. She was here earlier.
Other stories, we I know that Michelle on our the food systems calls that Pam and some others organized, that we were hearing that meat sales, local meat sales, are down this year over last. They had increased quite a bit during the pandemic, and now they're down a little bit. And I talked to well, you probably know him, Mike Calicrate out of Colorado Springs, who does a lot of meat processing and sales. And he said that his sales were up a huge amount last year, and now they're down quite a bit, but they're still up about 25% over normal, right? So that's good, but it's not like it was last year either. So
It makes me wonder too about how, you know, a lot of our local food producers really innovated last year, and they went online and they did all of these things to, you know, maintain sales and maybe even for some growers increase sales. But I'm curious about their bottom lines, and if we know, like, did it pay off for them, you know, or, you know, how did they sort of come out after all of that effort? And I don't know if we have data on that, or do we have data on that? I guess there's a question.
I think the data would be really interesting on that. You know, I did talk to somebody at the Columbia Farmers Market who told me that, yeah, sales were good, but it takes a lot more labor to achieve those sales. So his costs are up, right?
Mhm.
Has to have more people at the market serving customers, you know, more packaging, these kinds of things. Then I heard from an organic farmer that last year was one of his best years, that customers, there weren't that many more customers, but they bought a ton because they were cooking at home. So yeah.
Similar stories that I've heard too, Mary, very similar to that. It's a mixed bag, really depending on, were they doing any of this before COVID hit? And did they have kind of their processes down? Because if they didn't, and these processes were new, it could be exhausting, you know, having to do some of the things they had to do to change their processes, and the labor was fairly intense. So I think like everyone's asking these questions that we're asking now. We're planning to do an upcoming training that will invite producers to join. It's going to be a series of trainings, and hopefully we want to get some presentations from them to talk about these things, but then have a panel to discuss these very questions that we're talking about. It's not going to be the kind of data that we're talking about that we'd like to see, that would be across the board. But it will be interesting to see in Missouri producers from around the state, and, you know, having meat producers on, and value added folks, and fruit and vegetable growers, and different folks, to see how it impacted various operations and setups, and were they selling off a family farm? Were they going to the farmer's market before? You know, how things changed and their bottom line changed based on that.
Michelle, what did you drop into the chat? Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So there are lots of research projects that USDA funded last summer to try to get a handle on some of this and get some hardcore data, rather than what we've needed to rely on, which is primarily stories that we've heard here and there. And the first one that I dropped in is a USDA sponsored site that it's looking at all the different activities that they hear about related to COVID-19 and the food system. Colorado State is hosting that site, and I know there are quite a few people involved. The other thing I wanted to share with you was, of course, the project that I'm on that I can't find can't find the link to, but I will post it hopefully before the call ends. We're doing, we just completed a survey of supply chain businesses. We've got about 400 from the upper Midwest, 400 surveys returned, another approximately that many from the LA region. And then we've also focused on the Miami region. And we'll be using that survey data to start to see if if there are any specific patterns that we've missed or that are really key to thinking about resilience in the food supply chain. So keep your eyes open. I know we're going to do webinars. We've got another one coming up in June. We're going to have a national conference, probably largely online, in May of next year. So there'll be lots of opportunities to see the research results.
Bill, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sure. Do we have any final questions for Michelle? Looks like something just came in the chat. My sister-in-law tried her hand at raising chickens last year, which it sounds like others were interested in too. They started with 6, now they have none. It's tough. Yes, indeed. I hope
Predators.
at least the public will appreciate agriculture after the pandemic. Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, and I think it really is an opportunity to maybe do some resetting and think about, again, what matters to us about the food system and how do we need it to function to better serve our needs? Because really it was getting kind of out of hand there. Market access and food access were becoming problems in rural and urban areas. And here's a chance we have now to remake the system so it serves us better.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think that it's probably a pretty good time to close. Michelle, thank you very much. This has been informative and interesting, and really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thank you to all of our guests who joined us today. It's great to see so many of you. And yeah, we'll get this video edited and posted on our website within a week or so. We're not real quick about that, but feel free to check us out at foodsecurity.missouri.edu. And we're also on Twitter, which is something I forgot to mention, at MU Food Security. So again, thanks, Michelle. And thank you to everybody who joined today, and hope you have a good rest of your day.